My name is Mike and I am 34 years old. I did not come to this business right away. At first, it was a regular job. A warehouse, boxes, trucks, an endless routine that I endured for the sake of a stable salary. But one day, I saw a show of lighting fixtures that buy traditional forgotten containers at auctions. At first, it seemed like another TV show, but something caught my attention. People in dusty caps made bids, opened rusty doors of containers, and walked inside with vintage musical instruments, old comics, and sometimes even cooler ones. They smiled, laughed, shared their side, and looked at how much my things could be worth. The next day, I came home after work, got a beer, and turned on the show again. This time, I watched more carefully, listened to their phrases, and examined their finds. The thought was spinning in my head. Why can't I try the same? 2 weeks passed before I decided to do it. Quit my job, took some of my savings, and started looking for auction attendees. It turned out that there weren't enough events in the area. People take containers because of rent debts, throw away unnecessary things, and move to another state. And sometimes someone passes away, the family doesn't want to take what they consider to be junk, and the storage company you leave them at the auction to get back at least some of the money. Simple and rigid system. At first it was a reserve. I didn't know what to pay attention to. I was too often led by the loud conversations of other auction participants and bid on containers that, as was later promised, were filled with old mattresses, broken TVs, and shabby chairs. You can sell such things only for pennies. But I learned to look, listen, and predict. A year later, I was already one of those who stand at the door of the container with narrowed eyes and evaluate the severity in the smallest details. It's a whole science. For example, the container is slightly lowered. It means there may be dust and moisture. Are the edges of the boxes inside yellowed? Probably old and stale things. And if you can see a memorable logo on the box or a metallic sheen in the closet, it could be something valuable. Electronics, musical instruments, repair tools, or something else that can be quickly resold. Some luck smiled on me. In one container, I found a box of vinyl records, among which were rare copies. I got so much for them that I could easily live for a couple of months. In another container, I found a box with new packaged electronic devices. I made money on them. But most often it was hard, monotonous work with garbage. You lift old sofas, take out broken refrigerators, sort piles of clothes that are no longer in fashion. But I didn't complain. It was my choice. Each new container is like a lottery ticket. And if you read the signs correctly, you can guess the lucky number. One day, news came about a large auction in a neighboring town. The warehouse was familiar, and many containers had been standing there for years, forgotten by their owners. Such auctions always attracted attention. Old containers could be closed inside anything, from the things of deceased collectors to the remains of a business that had gone bankrupt. This is where, as old-timers said, you could find a gold mine. I arrived early. The composition of the auction was familiar. Local predators, people who come to every auction to snatch tasty clothes. There was a fat man named Martin, who always smiled too widely, and Joe with his eternal chewing gum in his cheek. But no one was afraid of me anymore. I knew that luck comes to those who know how to wait. They opened the containers one by one. I stood and watched. There was nothing interesting in the first 5 containers. Furniture, boxes of paper, a couple of old TVs. People lazily placed bets and moved on. But then came the turn of the 9th container. I immediately thought something unusual. The container showed no signs of moisture, and there was less dust than usual. When the doors opened, I noticed the boxes were neatly lined up. That was a good sign. There were no scattered items or old sofas that usually took up half the space. The boxes were all the same size and stood straight, like on shelves. Some of the boxes had foreign language writing on them. I recognized Japanese characters right away. My excitement began to stir. Experience told me that Japanese things were often valuable. Electronics, collectibles, figurines from old anime or manga series. These could bring in good money. I stood closer to the container doors and pretended not to be interested. Sometimes it's better not to show excitement, otherwise they'll start outbidding you. The auctioneer began with the usual phrase, "We'll start at $25. It wasn't much, but I was waiting. 50, 100, 150. People were bidding, and I got involved. 200, 250. I raised my hand. Fat Martin looked back and grinned. He knew me and liked to raise the bids when I made a move. He nodded to the auctioneer. 300. The bar was slowly rising, but I was not giving in. 400, 450. Fat Martin raised his hand. 500, the auctioneer said. A pause. No one wanted to go over that line. I raised my hand and showed 550. Fat Martin looked at me and grinned, as if I had bought myself trouble, but he did not interrupt. $550 for a container that I might not yet recoup was a risk, but risk was part of my life. As the doors closed behind me and I heard the lock that was now mine, I felt that familiar itch of anticipation. This was mine now, mine alone. I climbed inside and started with the top row of boxes. I opened the first one with a knife. Inside were hand-carved wooden figures. Each one depicted a different animal. Foxes, owls, bears, all in the Japanese style, laconic, but graceful. I knew that such figurines could be valuable to collectors. The second box contained books. Books in Japanese with color illustrations. They looked like old albums or manga. I carefully flipped through the pages. Some of the books contained postcards and letters with hieroglyphs. But the real find was waiting for me in the third box. I opened it and froze. Inside was a black case. An ordinary one, made of hard material, like for musical instruments. I opened it and saw something inside that made my heart beat faster. Inside the case was an old Japanese musical instrument, similar to a koto. It was in perfect condition, with strings made of the finest threads, and next to it lay a roll of parchment with drawings and instructions. I thought that perhaps with this one find I could win back the container. I stood over the case, feeling a strange mixture of delight and incomprehension. The wooden instrument, similar to a koto, looked almost new, although the details suggested that it was not one of the modern ones. The wood was dark, polished to a mirror shine. The strings were stretched perfectly. It smelled of something warm and dry, like antique furniture that had been standing in the shade for a long time. Next to the instrument lay a bundle, a piece of thick parchment. I unfolded it, and before me appeared graceful lines of Japanese calligraphy and several detailed drawings. These were instructions, diagrams showing how to press the strings correctly, and something like a list of compositions. To my surprise, one of the sheets had an inscription in English, "Play of the Soul." I do not know what it meant, but it looked intriguing. Usually I don't waste time. At auctions, every hour is money. The faster you go through the container, the faster you'll find something valuable and be able to sell it. But this was different. I carefully closed the case and put it aside. This instrument required attention. Perhaps it was an antique musical instrument, and they are always valued higher than ordinary things. The thought was already flashing through my head. I'll have to look to see how much this might cost. I began to open the other boxes with even greater interest. The second box contained fabric bundles. I expected to see ordinary rags or old clothes, but these were neatly folded kimonos. 5 pieces, each packed in a separate transparent bag. The fabric was thick and heavy, and the patterns were incredibly complex. Dragons, clouds, waves. I knew that such kimonos could cost serious money, especially if they were authentic and antique. I was already imagining myself putting them up for auction on the internet. Next came another box. Having opened it, I froze. They were masks. 6 masks made of wood and lacquer, hand-painted. Each had a different expression. One with a grimace of rage, another calm and cold, the third sad. These were traditional Japanese theater masks. I remembered seeing similar ones at a museum exhibition once. The tour guide had said that some of the masks were handmade by craftsmen and cost thousands of dollars. My mouth was dry with excitement. I carefully picked up one mask and turned it over in my hands. Smooth, cold, but warm to the touch. The chin of the mask was sharpened carefully, as if it had been made by a master. There were strange marks on the inside, perhaps the artist's signature. Euphoria overwhelmed me. Everything indicated that this container was not just a collection of old things. This was a find that could be turned into capital. I could already imagine myself photographing masks and kimonos for auction sites. My head quickly calculated possible prices. But that was not all. There was a tall, narrow box in the corner of the container. It looked like a wooden crate for transporting delicate goods, maybe a figurine or a painting. I had to use some force to rip the nails off and remove the lid. Inside, I saw something that I initially took for a painting. It was a carved wooden bas-relief depicting a mountain village surrounded by a dense forest. The wood was carved with incredible detail. The roofs of the houses, the branches of the pine trees, the bridge over the river. I looked at it and couldn't believe that someone had spent so much time creating such a thing. But the strangest thing was the fact that at the bottom of the bas-relief there were hieroglyphs again, and next to it was the date, 1936. A pre-war thing, I thought. I stroked the surface of the bas-relief with my hand, feeling the small irregularities of the wood fibers. It was a work of art, no less. Similar things sold for thousands at collectors' auctions. I quickly took a photo of it with my phone, so that I could later find similar images on the internet. By this point, I had realized that this container was more valuable than I had expected. It was a collection, perhaps the personal collection of someone who collected Japanese artifacts. Perhaps he was a collector or a scholar. Such containers are rare. Most often, you find rags and old things. There were 2 more large boxes left. I felt tired, but the excitement did not leave me. When I opened the first of them, I came across books. Not magazines, but old books, whose pages were yellowed and fragile. Most were in Japanese, but some were in English. They turned out to be textbooks on the art of ukiyo-e, a traditional Japanese woodblock print. Among them was a stack of postcards depicting old Japanese landscapes. The last box was lighter than I expected. When I opened it, I saw rolls of paper. Letters. There were about 40 of them, all in Japanese. Thick, grayish paper, written in ink. Almost all were folded the same way and tied with thin twine. This puzzled me. Personal letters rarely sell. Usually when I find such things, I just throw them away. But there was something special here. I unfolded one and saw an illustration inside. A delicate ink drawing of a riverbank with tea houses and boats. My curiosity grew. My heart was pounding. I had the sheet of paper with the drawing in one hand, and the case with the musical instrument clutched to me with the other, as if it were a relic. I don't know why, but I felt like these things were connected. I looked over the entire container again, checking if I had missed anything. After making sure there was nothing else of value, I began loading everything into my truck. I carefully laid the masks out so that they wouldn't get damaged. I stacked the books and packed the kimono in a box. The very last thing was the case with the instrument and the bundle of letters. When I closed the door of the van and turned the key in the ignition, I suddenly felt a strange calm. Normally, I would scream with joy after such a find, but this was different. It seemed like this find had been waiting for me, biding its time. On the way home, I couldn't stop thinking about this case, the letters, and the masks. Each find was valuable individually, but together they seemed like part of one big story. I had to figure it out. At home, I didn't immediately unpack my things. First, I decided to find information about koto and Japanese masks. After a few hours of searching on the internet, I learned that antique koto instruments can cost from $1,000 to several tens of thousands of dollars. Theatrical masks for no and kabuki also had their price, especially if they were made by a master. But the main thing was this case with the instrument. I returned to it, opened it, and ran my finger along the strings. A thin ringing sounded in the air, clean, but somehow deep. I wonder who it belonged to? Who touched these strings? I didn't know the answer to this question yet, but my intuition told me that something unusual and interesting was waiting for me ahead. Returning home, I immediately unloaded the container. Usually it takes a couple of hours. Take out, sort, throw out the trash, sell the rest. But not this time. Everything was different. Each item in this container seemed to be part of one big story, and I felt that I had no right to treat them as ordinary goods. First of all, I pulled out the case with the musical instrument, carefully placed it on the table, and opened it again. The strings were still shining under the lamplight. I sat down next to it and ran my finger along the strings. The sound was deep and clear, as if someone was quietly whispering something on the edge of audibility. I looked at the parchment with instructions again, complex chord diagrams and hand positions. Frankly, I had never been able to play any musical instrument, but something attracted me. A thought flashed through my head. What if I try? Just for fun, I placed the instrument on the table, leaned on my elbows, and tried to repeat the movements from the parchment. My fingers touched the strings, but all I could extract was an indistinct ringing and rattling. Leaning back in my chair, I closed my eyes and grinned. I'm not much of a musician, of course, but the thought wouldn't go away. Later that evening, I took up the next batch of finds, theater masks. I laid them out on the floor in a row. Each had its own face: anger, joy, sadness, wisdom, fear, and something resembling mockery. Each mask seemed to look at me with a silent question. I again noticed the marks on the inside. Perhaps this was the master's signature? I took pictures of all the masks and started searching on the internet. An hour later, I found something similar. Articles in collectors' forums pointed to a master named Hisanori Yoshida, a recognized carver of theater masks for the No Theater. It was mentioned that his works are recognizable by the characteristic lines of the mouth and fine notches on the inside. Comparing my photos with the samples from the articles, I realized the masks really could be his work. This discovery made my heart beat faster. Yoshida masks cost thousands of dollars. I had 6 of them, but the strangest object was the wooden carving of a village. It sat on a shelf opposite the table, and every now and then I found myself looking at it again. There was something mesmerizing about the scene. The pine trees, the rooftops, the river, the mountains in the distance. Everything seemed too alive, too real. I walked closer and studied the carving under a magnifying glass. In the corner, where the line of trees ended, I noticed a tiny symbol, almost invisible. A small hieroglyph, carved so neatly that it could be mistaken for part of the wood grain. Opening a translator app, I took a picture of the symbol and got the translation, shadow. The word stuck in my head like a forgotten melody. I couldn't explain why it seemed significant to me. Perhaps it was just the name of the carver, but inside, there was a strange feeling, as if something important was hanging on the tip of my understanding, but wouldn't come into my hands. The next day, I took some of the finds to an antique shop. The owner of the shop examined the masks for a long time and carefully. He turned them at different angles, felt the insides with his fingers, as if checking for authenticity. His gaze was focused, serious. I've seen such an expression on people's faces when they see something rare and valuable. His eyes lingered on the mouth line of one of the masks, and I noticed how he frowned, as if he was calculating something in his mind. When he finished examining, he said that he needed time to fully evaluate my finds, because they were very rare and unusual, and it was impossible to name a price right away. I realized that the masks were worth much more than I expected. These were the works of a master who rarely appeared on the market. In the evening, I returned home, keeping only one thing in mind. I can sell all this for a good price, but not the instrument. I opened the case again and looked at the instrument for a long time. I remembered the letters that I never opened. Taking them out of the box, I laid them out on the table. Each envelope was folded neatly, without damage. The paper had turned yellow, but was still strong. I decided to open the first envelope. Inside was a letter and a drawing. A mountain village was drawn in ink on the paper, the same one depicted in the bas-relief. But there was a man in the drawing. In his hands was a musical instrument, the same one that was now lying in front of me. I opened the next envelope. Another drawing. A village, but it was already evening. Several human figures were standing on the riverbank, Their faces turned to the man with the instrument. I opened the third one. This time it was night. The drawing depicted a fire, and there were people around it. In the center was the same man with the instrument. I opened all the letters. Each one had a scene from the same village, but at different times of day and at different moments in the lives of its inhabitants. Day, evening, night. A man was playing by the river. Children were listening to his music. Old people were sitting by the fire. Each drawing was simple, but life was read in it. In the last letter, instead of a drawing, there was text. A long text in Japanese. At first, I wanted to leave it for later, but something held me back. I translated the text using the app. Not everything was clear, the translation was clumsy, but I managed to get the meaning. The letter talked about music that preserves memory, about how sound lives as long as someone touches the strings, and about how an instrument carries with it the stories of those who held it in their hands. These words touched me deeper than I expected. The things in this container were not just objects. They were memories. Life. That night, I couldn't sleep for a long time. Images of the village, letters, the face of the man with the instrument were spinning in my head. I remembered touching the strings and hearing that clear, deep sound. The next morning, I put the masks, kimono, and carved bas-relief up for sale. Collectors responded quickly, offers pouring in. Buyers were looking for rare items, and I knew I had more than enough. But I didn't sell the instrument. A few weeks passed. The money from the sale of other items had long since settled in the account, but I still had the instrument. Sometimes I opened the case, sat at the table, and carefully touched the strings. My fingers were no longer as clumsy as on the first day. I could produce simple, clear melodies. The sound filled the room. Clear, soft, calm. I was not a musician and never would be. But at that moment, I felt something more. The instrument was no longer just a find for me. It was a memory of those people who lived in the village on the bas-relief, listened to music by the fire, and stood on the riverbank. Now this memory lived in me. I did not know how many more stories these strings preserved, but every time I touched them with my fingers, it seemed to me that I, too, became part of this music. Things come and go, but there are those that remain forever. As for the other items, after some time I managed to sell them to collectors for a lot of money. It would be indecent to name the amount, but it was tens of thousands of dollars.